W.E.B. Du Bois was born in 1868 in Great Barrington in the Berkshires, and I should say it's 2 p.m. on Saturday, and the result of the presidential election has just been announced, hence the honking. Anyway, Du Bois was born just a few years after classes started at MIT. He was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard in 1895. And he spent 3 years in a house in Cambridge, close to Harvard Square, on Flag Street. So let's go there. I'm guessing Biden won. Well, at least Cambridge seems to be coming together. Number 20 Flag Street. I guess I've never walked down the street before. It's a tiny little side street. Oh, and here we are. W.E.B. Du Bois, author, lecturer, and civil rights leader. Born and raised in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, largely educated in Cambridge. Great Barrington has been in the news recently in these COVID times. It lent its name to the Great Barrington Declaration. In 1961, Du Bois moved to Accra, Ghana. And he died there on August the 27th, 1963, at the age of 95. Received a state funeral. We're talking about gender as well as race this week, and I can bring women into this little historical tour of Cambridge if we walk back in the direction of my house. Hard to believe that it snowed in Cambridge last week. We're heading towards what used to be called the Agassiz School. Louis Agassiz founded the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology. Agassiz has a somewhat spotty reputation because he defended polygenism, the view that human races have different origins. And we're in an area of Cambridge called Agassiz, in fact. He certainly left his mark on the city. Maria Baldwin taught at the Agassiz School, becoming its master in 1916, and it's now called the Maria L. Baldwin School. Everything is connected to everything else. This asynchronous class, COVID, the Great Barrington Declaration, Great Barrington, W.E.B. Du Bois. And let me read you something from the school website. Maria Baldwin's home on Prospect Street was headquarters for various literary activities. There for years she held a weekly reading class for Negro students attending Harvard University, which counted among its regulars W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois remembered her reverently and honoured her as Man of the Month in the NAACP journal The Crisis in 1917, writing of her, "The Agassiz School, composed of kindergartners in 8 grades, is one of the best in the city and is attended by children of Harvard professors and many of the old Cambridge families. The teachers under Miss Baldwin, numbering 12, and the 410 children, are all white. Miss Baldwin thus, without a doubt, occupies the most distinguished position achieved by a person of Negro descent in the teaching world of America, outside cities where there are segregated schools." Here are the questions on sex and gender from the MIT undergraduate application. And here's the question on race from the 2020 census. Not as straightforward as questions about age, that's for sure. Today and Monday of next week, we'll talk about race, and then also on Monday and next Wednesday, we will talk about gender. So turning to race first. Ordinary people talk about race all the time. For example, Barack Obama was the first black US president. And our question is the metaphysical one. What does it take to be a black person? Or a white person? Or an Asian person? Or a Pacific Islander? And so on. Is it something about ancestry? Something about society? Maybe how you view yourself or how others view you? Or maybe a combination of ancestry and society? Or alternatively, maybe the standards for being black or white or Asian or whatever are too peculiar or exacting so that no one is actually black or white or a Pacific Islander or whatever. That's the question. In order to answer it, some terminology will be useful. You can look this up in the glossary. A category is just another way of talking about properties or features of things. So Mallory belongs to the category police officer if and only if, IFF, Mallory has the property or feature of being a police officer. Even more straightforwardly, if and only if she is a police officer. And Elliot belongs to the category mammal, if and only if Elliot has the property or feature of being a mammal, i.e., even more plainly, he is a mammal. As far as I know, Mallory does not belong to the category police officer, but Elliot does belong to the category mammal. So we can put the main issue in terms of categories, specifically in terms of racial categories, Asian, black, white, etc. Are these categories biological in some very broad sense? Or are they social, compatibly with being biological or social? Are they empty? But what is a biological category exactly? Well, we're not going to try to define it. A list of examples will suffice. So mammal, vertebrate, subspecies, clade, sibling, blood type O, XX karyotype, rosebush, cat, as in the domestic cat, Felis catus, are all biological categories. Now, things belong to all of these categories. That is, there are mammals, vertebrates, subspecies, creatures with blood type O, cats, and so on. But not all biological categories are like that. Some are empty, nothing belongs to them. Here are two empty biological categories: mermaid and Loch Ness monster. 3 notes about all this. First, biological category should be understood quite broadly. It shouldn't just be confined to technical categories that appear in biology textbooks. Second, humans, of course, are partly responsible for producing cats because we domesticated them. And rose bushes, many rose bushes have been cultivated by humans. That doesn't mean that the category rosebush or the category cat isn't biological. And finally, an observation about mermaids, which will be relevant later. In 1493, Christopher Columbus was sailing near the Dominican Republic and claimed to see 3 mermaids. In fact, they were probably manatees, not mermaids anyway. Columbus, not surprisingly, described them as nowhere near as beautiful as they appear in paintings. The observation is just that the right way to describe the situation is that Columbus mistook some manatees for mermaids. It's not as if there are mermaids, but they're very different from what we thought they were. Hold on to that thought. Turning now to social categories, here are some examples. Police officer, anesthesiologist, felon, student, hockey player, snob, husband, Republican, international cat show winner. Here's an empty social category, King of France. The intuitive idea is that if S is a social category, S is empty, that is, nothing belongs to S, unless there are societies of some sort. So no one is an anesthesiologist in a world without societies. Similarly, no one is a husband in a world without societies. You have to have the social institution of marriage in order for there to be husbands. And no animal is an international cat show winner in a world without societies. So we can put the issue in terms of categories. Are racial categories biological categories? Are they social categories? Or are they empty categories? Now, with respect to the first question especially, there seems to be no shortage of experts. So why not ask them? Well, here's one expert, Craig Venter of the Human Genome Project. He's a biochemist, geneticist. He was involved in sequencing the first human genome. So this is from the New York Times. The concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis, said J. Craig Venter in June 2000, standing beside President Bill Clinton to announce the completion of the first draft of the human genome sequence. And in another article, he's quoted as saying, race is a social concept, not a scientific one. Great. Well, that's one expert. Here is another expert, Jerry Coyne, who's an evolutionary biologist at the University of Chicago. This is from his blog, his blog, Why Evolution is True. In my own field of evolutionary biology, races of animals are morphologically distinguishable populations that live in allopatry, i.e. geographically separated. Blah, blah, blah. Under that criterion, are there human races? Yes. As we all know, there are morphologically different groups of people who live in different areas, though those differences are blurring due to recent innovations in transportation that have led to more admixture between human groups. Here's another person who ought to know what he's talking about, Timothy Caulfield, who's a Canada Research Chair in Health Law and Policy at the University of Alberta. And this is an article that appeared on March the 23rd, 2018. More important, we shouldn't forget that the concept of race is a biological fiction. The crude racial categories that we use today, black, white, Asian, etc., were first formulated in 1735 by the Swedish scientist and master classifier Carl Linnaeus. While his categories have remained remarkably resilient to scientific debunking, there is almost universal agreement within the science community that they are biologically meaningless. They are, as is often stated, social constructs. Just a quick note on that terminology of social constructs or social construction. This often comes up in these discussions, both of race and of gender. It actually causes nothing but confusion, so let's not use that term. Now, on the same day as it happened, March the 23rd, 2018, there appeared an article in the New York Times by a Harvard geneticist, David Reich, How Genetics is Changing Our Understanding of Race. I have deep sympathy, he says, for the concern that genetic discoveries could be misused to justify racism. But as a geneticist, I know that it is simply no longer possible to ignore average genetic differences among races. Now, this is not to say that Reich thinks that ordinary racial categories, black, white, Asian, and so on, are biological. But on Reich's view, these ordinary racial categories do not appear to be, in Caulfield's phrase, biologically meaningless. As you can imagine, there were a few letters appearing in the New York Times about this article. To the editor, David Reich does a disservice to the many scientists and scholars who have demonstrated the scientific flaws of considering race a biological category. At last, a Harvard geneticist, David Reich, admits that there are genetic differences between human races, even though he puts the word race in quotation marks. Despite David Reich's explicit support for equality in matters of human variation, his essay emphasizing biological differences among humans based on modern genetics is troubling to me as a cultural anthropologist and a clinical psychologist. Well, what's the moral? It's simply this. Do not try to settle the issue by appealing to authority. Motivated reasoning, where one contrives to support a conclusion that one is antecedently committed to holding, is a clear danger, and even the very best credentialed authorities disagree. As with most of the questions raised in this class, you will just have to think these issues through for yourself. This course is not telling you what to think on any philosophical issue, not just this one. What we're trying to do instead is teach you how to think. Let me now sketch the views of our three protagonists from the readings, Kwame Anthony Appiah, Quayshawn Spencer, and Sally Haslanger. Appiah first. Are racial categories biological categories? Yes, they are. At least, I think that's the most straightforward interpretation of Appiah. Are racial categories social categories? No. Are racial categories empty? Yes. Racial categories are biological categories like mermaid or Loch Ness monster. That view is somewhat misleadingly put as there are no races. It's really the view that no one is Asian or black or white, etc. The existence of races, thought of as categories, is not really being denied, or at any rate, that's not the main point. The main point is just that no one is Asian or black or white, and so on. Now, see the interview I did with Appiah for some qualifications about his views. For our purposes, we can just interpret Appiah in the simplest way possible, as Quayshawn Spencer does. See page 572 of the Norton Anthology. And turning to Quayshawn Spencer, are racial categories biological categories? Yes, they are. They are human continental populations. Are racial categories social categories? No, they are not. Are racial categories empty? No. Human beings, plenty of human beings, belong to human continental populations. And finally, Sally Haslanger, excuse me, are racial categories biological categories? No, they are not. Are racial categories social categories? Well, yeah, maybe, but the important point is that we should use racial vocabulary to pick out social categories. This may involve a change of meaning in words like Asian, black, white, and so on. Her emphasis is not so much on what it is to be black, but how we should use the word black. What concept should we use the word black to express? Are racial categories empty? No, they are not. Now, these views cannot be sensibly discussed without having some basic understanding of human evolution. Modern humans, of course, evolved in Africa, and they migrated out of the continent in a number of waves, one perhaps around 130,000 years ago, the other around 70,000 years ago. A recent study suggests that they might have left even earlier, around 200,000 years ago. And they colonized almost every corner of the globe. Sooner or later, sometimes sooner and sometimes later, humans reached Australia, for example, 50,000 years ago, and the Americas comparatively recently, around 15,000 years ago. All dates, I should emphasize, are approximate. Now, when populations of animals of the same species are isolated or relatively isolated, they tend to genetically diverge because of genetic drift, or in some cases, depending on the environment, natural selection. Genetic drift is random change in the frequency of genetic variants or alleles. Your genome thus contains information about your ancient ancestry. Here's my 23andMe chart. I'm descended from that branch of humanity that reached Europe. You shouldn't take that 100% figure particularly seriously, but it's a safe bet that I am in what Quayshawn Spencer calls the Eurasian human continental population. There's some more useful information about the relevant genetics and evolutionary history in the introduction to the Race and Gender chapter, so I recommend that you read that. When humans left Africa, they interbred with at least two kinds of archaic humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans. Some of this Neanderthal DNA may have made its way back to Africa because these early migrations were not all one way. As you can see, I have a decent amount of Neanderthal ancestry myself, something you may have already guessed. Now, here's an important point to keep in mind as we discuss these questions about race. People can think and talk about things that belong to a category C despite being confused in various ways about C. So, for example, Anaxagoras, who lived in Athens about 2,500 years ago, thought that the sun and stars were fiery stones. And Ptolemy, who lived in Alexandria in Egypt, thought that the stars were fixed to the celestial sphere centered on the earth. both Anaxagoras and Ptolemy thought and talked about existing things, stars, despite being seriously mistaken about what stars were. So if Anaxagoras says there are stars and stars are fiery stones, he's right on the first count, there really are stars, but wrong on the second count. He was seriously mistaken about the nature of stars. However, here there seems to be a contrast with mermaids and manatees. So if we imagine Columbus saying there are mermaids, and mermaids are half women, half fish, the verdict is quite different. Columbus is wrong on the first count. It's not that he's right on the first count, that there are mermaids, but wrong on the second count, because in fact, mermaids are manatees. So what's the difference between the mermaids manatees case and the example of Anaxagoras thinking that the stars are fiery stones? That is a question for you. The reason why this is relevant is that someone like Appiah thinks that the category Asian is more like the category mermaid than it is like the category star. There is no doubt plenty of confusion about the category Asian. Maybe some people think that to be Asian, you need to have some special Asian genes. That is false. But does that mean that we should treat the category Asian like the category mermaid and say that in fact there are no Asians, that it was just an illusion that there were Asians to begin with? Or should, alternatively, we treat the category Asian like the category star? Okay, there are stars, but they're quite unlike what we thought they were. And there's certainly no shortage of confusion around the topic of race. Let me end by discussing a couple of them. So suppose that there are genetic differences, perhaps significant, between the A's and the B's. It is tempting to conclude that the categories A and B are biological categories, or that they're not social categories. That is a mistake. Here's an example. Let A be the category of people whose first name is Emily, and B be the category of people whose first name is Jacob. There will be significant genetic differences between the A's and the B's. Of course, the vast majority of the B's and hardly any A's will have a Y chromosome. But A and B are social categories, and they're not, in any intuitive sense, biological ones. And here is the converse confusion. Suppose that the genetic differences between the A's and the B's are insignificant or non-existent. It can be tempting to conclude that the categories A and B are not biological. That is also a mistake. So, for example, at least in theory, members of different clades could be genetically identical. So a clade, or a monophyletic group, is a group of organisms that consists of a common ancestor and all its descendants. So, as you can see from this diagram, the crocodiles and the birds form a monophyletic group. Monophyletic groups, or clades, are biological categories, if any categories are, and in practice, members of different clades will differ genetically, but that's not guaranteed. You could have two clades A and B, and the genetic differences between the A's and the B's could be either insignificant or, at the extreme, non-existent. So, in other words, don't get too hung up in these discussions on genes. That's it for lectures for this week. we'll continue with Appiah and Spencer on Monday, and also start looking at Sally Haslanger's paper, so do read that for Monday. A quiz will be distributed next week. And this week I should have my interview with Anthony Appiah up. One more week to go before Thanksgiving. I'll see you next time.